today I'm going to, of course, be moving on to talk about the Phoenicians. Yeah, Phoenician culture, their civilization is pretty old. I think it goes back over 3,000 years. I want to say maybe going back to like 1200 BC might be around when they started as a culture. So they kind of go back to like the beginning of the Iron Age, the Phoenicians overall. And talk a few things, of course, about the Phoenicians as a culture. I've got different slides, of course, you can look at later overall that I've got in Canvas. But yeah, they were a Semitic people, you know, just like the Israelites, which I'll talk about later. They lived in kind of the same region, what would be like called Canaan, like the land of Canaan, but they lived more in what would be now called modern Lebanon. So that's actually where we call ancient Phoenicia was a long time ago. And you can see there the Phoenicians were known as a maritime civilization. They were known for being great sailors, like sailing like throughout the Mediterranean Sea. They also, I think, sailed on the Sea of Galilee, which is up in like the northern part of Israel today. You saw in the video, they called them the purple people. That's what the Greeks called them, the purple people, which it comes from either that Greek word meaning phoenix, or there's another word which I think is phenos, the word phenos, which was apparently the Greek word for the word dye, because they were known for their dye cloth and all that, the Phoenicians. And like they said in the video, the dye was made from this type of, you see up there, that little picture there, the type that was made from snails, sea snails, which I think really like a sea mollusk, I think is I guess what they call it also as well. And the scientific name, of course, for the actual sea snail is called murex, M-U-R-E-X, that you see there. And it was called all kinds of names. The actual dye, it was called the royal purple, it was called the Tyrian purple. Those are different nicknames that they called it. They call it Tyrian purple because Tyrian was the name of one of their cities called Tyre, which is right here. And the Phoenicians were actually not really a kingdom. They were like a collection of city-states that were in the eastern Mediterranean, where Lebanon is today. Tyre, Sidon, and I think Byblos, those three right there, probably the most famous cities that were well known. Tyre is where you get that term Tyrian purple from, of course. Oh, the word Byblos, I don't know if you know it, is where they get the word Bible. It originated from that, because I suppose these parts of the Bible were written there at one point on, I guess, scrolls at the time. So that's the land of, you know, ancient Phoenicia. So it's kind of like above Israel, which is right here. And then you've got like the Assyrians and Syria over here to the north and east of them over here. Other things, of course, I did want to mention too, like I was talking about how the Phoenicians were great sailors. They think that the Phoenicians not just sailed into the Mediterranean Sea, but I think they say at one point the Phoenicians may have gone into like the Atlantic Ocean. I think there's even some crazy theory that they may have sailed down to the tip of Africa, like the bottom of Africa. I don't know if some people claim they did, maybe. But they were known for having the first, what they call galley ships, which they kind of talked about in the video. And the Phoenicians were known for their ships that were called a bireme. A bireme was a type of galley ship that used like oars, like rowing with oars, and had two banks of oars, like one on top of each other. And it's the first of many kinds of ships similar to that. Like the Greeks later had the so-called trireme, you may have heard of, and I think the Romans had the quinquereme, which are all kind of based on similar models going back to the Phoenicians. And most of their ships were made of either pine or cedar. Cedar is the more common tree that you hear about. That was in ancient Phoenicia, now Lebanon. And if you know about Lebanon, the flag on the Lebanese flag, the actual tree on there is a cedar tree that's there. I've got some maps showing also like how the Phoenicians spread out. They didn't stay where Lebanon is. They kind of, like I said, pushed westward throughout the Mediterranean Sea, trading and exploring. And over time, they began to set up trade networks and colonize different parts of the Mediterranean, like in mostly North Africa and also the islands of Italy, like Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. At one point, they even went into Spain, like the southern part of Spain, and began colonizing that area. The most famous colony they created was where Carthage is, like the city of Carthage, which was founded about maybe 900 BC. It was founded where modern Tunisia is, the state of Tunisia, which is in North Africa. So it's kind of like very close to where Sicily is. When you look at this map, Carthage is about right here. Sicily's right here. And pretty much the Carthaginians, as they're called later, dominate the Western Mediterranean Sea until they really come into being challenged by the Romans. The Romans later, the Roman Republic, which is in Italy, will eventually challenge them for supremacy of the western part of the Mediterranean. They get into a bunch of wars you've probably heard of called the Punic Wars, because the Romans used to call them Punicus, which was a Latin word meaning Phoenician. So the Romans knew that the Phoenicians were related, the Carthaginians were related back to the Phoenicians and all that. It looks like Drake has joined us. Good morning. Hope you're doing great out there overall. So that's the Phoenicians, right? We'll get more into later about talking about the what happens to the culture of the Carthaginians, because eventually the Romans destroy their culture. They wipe them out, if you know about that. Then the other thing, of course, the Phoenicians are known for as well. They're famous for their alphabet that they had also as well. And Phoenician alphabet was considered the first major, anyway, phonetic alphabet that was, I guess we call it simplified. Like Egyptian, like hieroglyphs, cuneiform were also phonetic, but they were just so complicated with, hundreds and hundreds of symbols being used. While the Phoenician one was pretty simple. It was like basically just 22 letters, 22 consonants that was in it. And they say part of why the Phoenicians developed the alphabet was so that they could communicate with people, of different cultures, because they were trading all throughout the Mediterranean Sea. They trade with Egypt. They think they trade with the Minoans. They think they probably trade with the ancient peoples of Italy and Spain and so on. And then those in North Africa, also as well. So they had to, be able to understand people and so on. And that they think that the Phoenician language, like they said in the short little video, that over time, it basically influenced other peoples. Like a lot of your languages, like the Indo-European languages, were heavily influenced by Phoenician, like Greek, Latin, etc. They think a lot of Semitic ones too, Aramaic, Hebrew, Arabic. Those are all influenced by, they think, Phoenician at one point. And you can see it almost kind of looks like, I think I've got the symbols of Phoenician that's on the screen, but those are also the actual names on the bottom are like kind of like Hebrew that's being used. So it's very similar like Hebrew later, stuff like that, written right to left, etc. But that's their legacy. Yeah, language is pretty much their legacy, like what they left behind, because most of their culture, later was wiped out. In fact, the Romans, like in 2nd century BC, wiped out Carthage. They totally destroyed it. It was like a Holocaust kind of, and so we don't really know much about their history except from Roman perspective later overall. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on next. Of course, we're going to next talk about the Israelites. That's the other thing we'll get into, which were a type of Semitic people, of course, that were, based also in Canaan as well. So they were also kind of a Semitic type people, very similar to what the Phoenicians were a long time ago. And if you know about the Israelites, they, of course, were famous for monotheism. I'm sure you know it, monotheism, right? It's the idea of, having like a religion based on one God, pretty much, which they popularized, the idea of monotheism. And these were a type of Semitic people based in ancient Canaan, which was, of course, what we now call, we basically call it now modern Israel, but also part of Jordan. It was also where they were based as well. I've got different slides on that too, also as well. That's the main slide, but I've got other ones that are better, which are right here. Now, some background, of course, about the Israelites. As you know, they are the first of these Abrahamic religions that we have later. They popularized it so much that it evolved into eventually ancient and then later into modern Judaism, today still practiced throughout the world, pretty much. I think Israel and America have the most Jews overall today, because the Jewish people are believed to be descended back to the Israelites and Hebrews. They're also called Hebrews also as well. And that popularized monotheism so much that it led to the rise of Christianity and also Islam as well. So those are all kind of based on some of these ideas that kind of go back to Abraham and Moses, that are in, of course, the Old Testament. Of course, the Israelites, like I said, were the first to kind of popularize the idea of, worshiping one God. And of course, that name of that God that's often mentioned in the, Bible is the God Yahweh, which was, pronounced in different ways. It's kind of a debate about how you say the name. Yahweh, Javeh, Yahweh. There's all kinds of ways that it's said. That's because nobody knows how they actually said it. It was such a long time ago in ancient times. However, around the 13th century or so, like in the, I guess getting up to like the late Middle Ages, Catholic monks started using the term Jehovah, which is actually how they pronounced it originally, Jehovah, because back then the J was silent. Now they say Jehovah, but it's Jehovah. And that became the name that they use a lot also for the same thing, for originally the Hebrew God a long time ago. Of course, today that a lot of Jews don't use that name anymore. I think they joke, if you said it, you got stoned or something like that. Jehovah, oh, shouldn't say it, Yahweh or whatever. So, but anyway, but yeah, I think today Jews use different names there's different names for God, like in Judaism, I know, which the main one they use, Adonai, is the common name, which means usually means Lord, or they also say Elohim is another one that's kind of popular, or Eloheinu or something like that. But anyway, let's talk about, of course, the history, of course, of the early history of the Jews or Israelites, of course. Most of their history is based from the Old Testament, which, of course, is the Christian name for what they call the Hebrew Bible overall. Jews today do not call it the Old Testament. Maybe if they do say something in English, it'll be like the Hebrew Bible or something like that. Jews actually call the Old Testament the Tanakh. That's what they dub it, the Tanakh. And I think I've got a slide on that, the Tanakh, which it's actually an acrostic. I don't know if you know what that is. An acrostic, it's basically a name which means multiple things. But I'll put it on the screen for you. But basically, there's like 3 sections of it that are in the Hebrew Bible that they split it up. This is also in like the Christian churches. They pretty much, like in the Catholic faith, Orthodox, Protestant churches, they kind of split it up also as well. You've got the Torah or the law, of course, which they often call the 5 books of Moses. The 5 books of Moses, by the way, I'll put on the screen, are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those are also the more modern names they use. The Jews also use like the names are actually named after like the first part of the sentence, like the first sentence in it. They actually name it from there instead. But those are the 5 right there. Also, the 5 books of Moses, of course, are also known as, in Greek, also known as the Pentateuch, which Pentateuch means in Greek 5 books, 5 books of Moses, basically. Then you got the other sections. The word Tanakh, of course, from Nevi'im or Nebi'im, either pronounced either way, which is like the prophets, and also the some people put the books of wisdom in there. Some churches do, I guess, that way. Ketuvim or Ketuvim, either way. The writings, it's like the minor prophets and all that. But actually, the word Torah usually means the law. Nevi'im means prophets in Hebrew, and Ketuvim means writings in Hebrew, since the names and all that. So T and K, Tanakh, basically, it's an acrostic. So anyway, that's kind of like where we get most of our history. There's other sources too, like I mentioned sometimes Flavius Josephus, I think, wrote, like I want to say 2,000 years ago, a lot of history about the Jewish people, the Jewish antiquities, which you may have heard of. It's another good source on the history of the Jews also as well, which are outside the Bible overall. Now, let me get into and talk about, like, in Genesis, the book of Genesis, of course, the first book in the Old Testament that you have. The patriarchs, are the ones that are the most important overall from the beginning. Of course, you can go all the way back to, Adam and Noah, etc. But the ones that are the more important ones in the beginning of the actual, ancient religion of Judaism overall. Yeah, the 3 greatest, of course, you can see there are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, of course, is considered to be the original founder, the one that was considered like the father of many nations. I think is usually the translation that they'll usually say about Abraham, and originally came from Mesopotamia, the city of Ur. He and his wife Sarah, he was told by God to move to Canaan, ancient Canaan, land of Canaan, which he did, of course. And if you know about Abraham, he had two sons. He had, of course, Isaac through his main wife Sarah, who, by the way, was barren for many years and couldn't conceive. And then Isaac is where the Jews trace their lineage back to, the Jewish people, and so on. And then the Arabs supposedly they trace their lineage back to Ishmael. Ishmael was believed also to be a son of through Abraham through a handmaid named Hagar. You may have heard of. Who, of course, I think Jews and Christians kind of see as being illegitimate or whatever, but of course, the Arabs, Muslims don't, but that's basically where a lot of the idea of the Arabs and Jews originate from. So they're kind of like Arabs and Jews are kind of like almost like half brothers, more or less, related back to each other a long time going back to Abraham. I think the Arabs they call it Ibrahim instead of Abraham. It's kind of similar, pretty much in Arabic. I won't talk as much about Isaac, but yeah, Jacob is pretty important. He's probably the one that you need to know about the most overall out of the 3. And Jacob, like the grandson of Abraham or son of Isaac, is the one that had all the sons. He had like 12 sons that would end up dividing into what they called later the so-called 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob had actually 12 sons through 4 different women. He did. You may have heard of Leah and Rachel, which were his 2 main wives, which I think Leah had about 6 of the sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. And Rachel had Joseph and Benjamin. And then the other 2 were handmaids, Bilhah, Zilpah. Bilhah had Dan and Naphtali, and then Zilpah had Gad and Asher. Those are all the ones. If you want all the 12, I don't think you have to know the 12 sons and all that. The 12 tribes, that's kind of, you don't have to know all that. But those are the 12, of course, if you want to put them on the screen for you. But you can go back and get those if you want later. But yeah, those are the 12. And then over time, what's going to happen is eventually, when they settle in Canaan later, after Egypt, they'll form the kingdom of Israel, which will kind of form out of those 12 tribes in the future. That's, of course, much later, of course, when that happens. Now, as you know, what ends up happening later is that the Israelites end up migrating to Egypt. That's they're not sure kind of when it was. It was like a long time ago when it actually occurred. In the book of Genesis, it's like one of the last parts of the book of Genesis, that and the story of Joseph that comes later. They do believe that famines had a lot to do with why the Israelites eventually moved to Egypt, because the Nile River basin is so fertile for growing crops. So that's why they all went there eventually. Good morning, Jillian, by the way. Got that one, just came in, I guess. But anyway, so they moved to Egypt at one point. And of course, the story that they kind of link between, I guess, Canaan and their migration later into Egypt is, of course, the famous story of Joseph that you may have heard about. It's one of the last, I think, major stories that's really in the book of Genesis overall. And Joseph, you know about it, was one of the favorite sons of Jacob, who eventually was enslaved by, I think, 10 of his brothers at one point. They were kind of sick of him for several reasons. One, well, besides the fact that he was treated more favorable by Jacob, they gave him this coat, which they call sometimes the coat of many colors. Kind of a debate about what it looked like or what it was actually called sometimes also as well. But also, there was also another thing that's very famous about Joseph, and the fact that he had this knack for interpreting dreams, which kind of annoyed him also as well. And when there was like a caravan that was coming through Canaan, they basically sold him into slavery. And he ended up in Egypt. And when he was in Egypt in prison at one point, he heard how the Pharaoh was having these bad dreams, how he was seeing like, I think he was seeing like cows that were really skinny and some that were fat. And what he figured out was that some years we were going to have a famine and some years it was going to be great crops. And so what happened was Joseph came up with this idea to build silos, grain silos, to store grain when they had famines. And so what happened over time was that Joseph ended up becoming like a powerful vizier, like a chancellor of some type or minister to one of the pharaohs. They're not sure which one it was, though, in the Bible. And so he became very powerful. And later, when the Israelites all moved to Egypt, he was kind of reunited with his brothers. And Jacob, by the way, is the only patriarch that was actually buried supposedly in Egypt overall. So that's the story of, story of Joseph and all that, what happened. So they get reconciled and so on. Then, of course, you got the other story, which, that follows the book of Genesis, which is the second book, which is Exodus. Of course, everybody knows about also as well. And between like the time of when like Joseph died in Moses's time, they believed that the Israelites or Hebrews were in Egypt for like over 400 years. It may have been like 430 years or something like that. And at one point they were enslaved. I don't know if it was quite 400 years they were enslaved. It's kind of debated how long it was, 300 to 400 years at least, that they were enslaved at one point. And there's a debate about when they came in. I don't know if you know about this. I think I've talked about this before about, the book of Exodus. And there's this comparable story. I think I told you about how, I think it was Josephus believed that the Israelites came in when the Hyksos invaded. So that would put it like about 17th century, maybe. if they did come in, it had to be like around that time, 17th century, so that's when the second intermediate period started, roughly, they think. And Josephus was getting a lot of his sources from Manetho. I told you, that ancient Egyptian writer who I think was writing before Josephus, a couple hundred years maybe. And whether that's true or not, they're not sure. And how they were related, there's a debate about maybe are they related or are they allied with them. It's kind of debated about what it was. So they're not sure if that source is through Manetho and Josephus is really accurate or not. I told you about a story before about a character they call it Osarseph, who was some kind of renegade priest. And some people think that was Moses, but they're not sure if that's a accurate story or not compared to the Bible. But the book of Exodus, of course, is primarily a story about the Egyptian prince and, of course, priest. Well, not a priest, but he was actually a prophet, of course, Moses, who, of course, is a Hebrew that eventually frees the Israelites from slavery in ancient Egypt a long time ago. And yeah, he may have been, I don't know, maybe he was a priest. It's possible he could have been. They don't really know for sure. But what we do know is that Moses is considered one of the greatest prophets in Judaism. If you know about it, the Jews today often call Moses their great lawgiver, or just the lawgiver. They called him as well. So he's the greatest prophet in Judaism. A lot of other religions too, like Christianity and Islam also respect Moses too, a lot. See him as kind of like almost like a early prophet to Jesus or Muhammad. And so he's kind of the founder of Mosaic law, the one that eventually wrote down the 10 Commandments in the Bible. So he's a very important figure. And they do think he was some kind of Egyptian prince. They think at the time when Moses lived, there was a period where apparently the population of the Hebrews had exploded. And the Pharaoh was kind of concerned about this. And so if you know the story about it, he sent out a decree where all the firstborn males, like the sons, would be killed, like the babies. And so if you know about it, Moses' mother, her name was Jochebed, put Moses in a basket and floated him on the Nile River. And of course, a miracle happened, and one of the Pharaoh's daughters found him. And so the name Moses, which Hebrew, by the way, is Moshe, as I say it, Hebrew. Yeah, Moshe means to take from the waters. That's actually what the name translates from Hebrew. Later, of course, Moses grew up. Of course, he finds out later that he's actually from the he's a Levite. He's from the tribe of the Levi tribe, And he kind of is like, finds out who his mother is, and he's got a sister named Miriam. He's got an older brother named Aaron, of course. He's also got a father named Amram, also as well. And anyway, what happens later, he ends up killing a fellow Egyptian. He's raised as a prince, in the house of one of the pharaohs, which they don't know who the pharaoh actually is. And so he eventually flees to, they think that Moses fled Egypt at one point, and he went eastward. There's kind of a debate about this, but some people think he went to the land of Midian, which land of Midian would be maybe where the Sinai desert is, possibly to the east of Egypt. Although some people think it was in Saudi Arabia. And he encounters God, like a burning bush representing God, on what is Mount Horeb, which was later called Mount Sinai, because some people think it was in the Sinai Peninsula. But Mount Horeb was the original name that it was actually called. And God, of course, instructed Moses to go back and free his people from Egypt and the Pharaoh. Of course, Moses, if you know about it, relented. He didn't want to do it because he wasn't exactly a great speaker. Like they say, he was a stutterer, Moses. And so he brought his brother with him, Aaron, his older brother, who acted as a spokesman for him. Of course, how they got freed, as you know, is that the so-called 10 plagues were put on, Egypt. If you know about this, by God, supposedly in the Bible, in the Exodus story, which they don't know who the Pharaoh was. Again, maybe it was Ramses or one of those Ramses. There's like 11 of them that had that name. But yeah, the river turned to blood, frogs, lice, flies, pestilence, boils on the skin, hail and fire, locusts, complete darkness, even. And of course, the most famous, the 10th plague, of course, was the death of the firstborn male or son. That's basically the one that I think most people know the most overall. Yeah, after all those 9, the first 9, he wouldn't relent. And finally, when his own son died, the Pharaoh's son, that's when he decided to let him go, of course. Yeah, the 10th plague has often been associated with what they call Passover. If you know about this, every spring, Jews celebrate the holiday of Passover, which is kind of a bittersweet holiday, celebrating the fact that their ancient people were allowed to leave Egypt. They were freed as slaves, and they left Egypt. And the story goes that where the term Passover, which the Hebrew is Pesach, is the fact that Moses was told by God to basically put lamb's blood on the doors of their people's houses, and the angel of death would pass over and not kill their firstborn sons. I think they tried to instruct the Egyptians to do the same thing, but they wouldn't do it. And so all their firstborn sons all died. So that's where the term Passover comes from. Up to modern times, like Christians use the term Passover as well for Easter. So for a long time overall. So from there, the Israelites then left Egypt. And of course, supposedly in the Bible, they crossed the Red Sea, as you know, into the Sinai desert, where Moses then brought them back to what is Mount Sinai, which, of course, they think that Mount Sinai is in the southern part of Egypt. If you watch that video I gave you to watch, the 7 wonders of ancient Egypt, that was one of the wonders they talked about, which is Mount Sinai, which the Arabs call it Jebel Musa, which means the mountain of Moses, which is about 7,000 to 8,000 feet tall. You can see it's about how tall it is. You saw it maybe in that video, that famous monastery that's there called Mount Catherine, I think they call it monastery, which has been there forever. It's an Orthodox monastery. So that might be the location of where, Moses, went up on the mountain, of course, and received the 10 Commandments, which was there. So they think that's the tradition of when he wrote it down, the so-called, Mosaic law or commandments. And they also believe, like Jews today, also believe that Moses started writing down not just that, but the books of the Bible. Like they think the first 5 books, parts of it were written down by Moses at that point, also as well. Of course, there's a debate about if he wrote all of them. I think for a long time, for traditions, from a long time ago, was that he wrote all 5 of the books in the first 5 books, the law, the Torah, and 5 books of Moses. And they think now that that's not true anymore. They've actually done a lot of scholarly research, especially on the Hebrew that was written. And one thing they did find of why they know now that it wasn't written by the same person was that they found out that different writers use different words for God. Remember I told you the Jews have different names for God that they use. I think it knows Hashem, which means his name, Hebrew. They don't want to say the God's name, that kind of thing, because it's so holy. And so, yeah, so that's why they know it, because of the different words of God being used. So as it was the same writer, he would have used the same word for God, that kind of deal. I think is what they theorized anyway. Oh, oral traditions of the Talmud. If you know what the Talmud is, was supposedly started by Moses, they think, like a long time ago, also as well, at least at that time. Don't forget, they also have the Ark of the Covenant. That's another thing, of course, that's well known. Supposedly God was instructed Moses to build this chest where they would put the 10 Commandments, like the 2 tablets that would go in it. Of course, there's a debate about what went in it, because there's even a theory that they put like Aaron's rod in there and a few other things as well, like a jar of manna or something like that. And I don't know if you read stories about the Ark of the Covenant in the Bible, but there's a lot of stories where it was almost like a weapon. They literally take it across a river and the river would part, or the Philistines or somebody would steal it. And bad things would start happening to them. It's like something out of that Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of movie or something like that. But there's stories like that actually exist, where it put like curses on the enemy and things like that. So the ark itself was also put in this mobile tent that was called the Tabernacle, or sometimes called the Holy of Holies. And it was supposed to be like where the Spirit of God dwelled. I think another name they called it was Shekinah or Sakina, which is the Hebrew meaning to dwell. So where God dwelled, basically. And so everywhere they would go, the Israelites were kind of nomadic. They would bring it with them. And later when they built the Temple of Jerusalem, like the Temple of Solomon and the Second Temple later, they would have a tabernacle type room where the ark would go in there, where they would put it in there. And supposedly, like around the time of the High Holy Days, which is like usually in the fall, when you have like, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, if you know about that in Judaism, that's the only time when the high priest would go in there and say the name Yahweh. I think that's the only time he could do it, or something like that. But I think they say on the Temple Mount that where the Dome of the Rock is, like where they have that rock that's there, in the Dome of the Rock, that Islamic shrine, they think that's maybe where the ark was or located. They theorize anyway. All right, no, after Moses died, what happened next, then they think that the Israelites would kind of wander around for something like 40 years in the desert. And then eventually they had this Israelite leader who was a general named Joshua. You may have heard the book of Joshua. You may have read that before. And he's the one that brought the Israelites back to Canaan, which I think before Moses had sent some spies in there to kind of see what's there. Like I think Caleb and a few others were sent there in the Bible. And they came back and told Moses it was like the land of milk and honey. And so they decided to go back there and settle there. They thought maybe it might be a famine still or something like that. So they went back, and Joshua, of course, was one of their first great leaders. And he would actually take what is Jericho, which is in kind of like the West Bank now, Palestine. But he would take that, the Battle of Jericho, which it's debated about when it took place, 13th, 14th century. They're not really sure when it was. But they think that's the beginning of when, of course, they would live there. But other people lived there too, like the Philistines and other groups that were there, Moabites, etc. And they would kind of have to fight for control of that region, which is kind of like they think the beginning of the early Iron Age. They kind of probably move in there at one point. Now they think that what happened over time was that they eventually formed into like one state, which became, they called it different names, but commonly the common name they called it is the United Kingdom of Israel. That's the common name you'll often see. Some people say Kingdom of Israel, but some people don't use that because it's confusing, because later it splits to two states, one called Judah, one called Israel. So oftentimes United Kingdom is the term they use for the early Israel state. So all the 12 tribes, over time will eventually form this one state, which will be about where modern Israel and also part of Jordan is, what you see in this map. You can see here's kind of a map of the states right here when it was like one, like under King Saul, David, etc., and probably Solomon later as well. And then on the right, you see that's when they split. It was split later into these two states, Kingdom of Israel, the north based at Samaria, and the other one based at Jerusalem, where Kingdom of Judah is. So you can see all these these other states they got around them as well that they fought also as well. Now they had different kings, like the early United Kingdom state had three major kings, as you've probably heard of: King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. It's pretty easy to remember overall. There's probably more than that. They had, I think there may have been like one other one that was a king, but maybe a minor one that was there. Those are the three major ones that they had overall. King Saul, of course, like I said, was the one that began to kind of unite the state as one. He pretty much brought all the tribes together to form the Kingdom of Israel. They think he was from the tribe of Benjamin originally. I think, in fact, Benjamin and Judah, those are the only two main tribes that really have kings through them. And his reign was not as famous as like David and Solomon. The reason why was because he was not as successful militarily against a lot of their enemies, especially the Philistines. If you know about it, Saul was eventually killed on what is the Battle of Mount Gilboa. It's called, which is kind of debated about when it was. Maybe close to 1005 or 1010 BC. It's maybe when that battle happened. And I think some of his sons were killed too, also as well. Though I think Saul actually committed suicide rather than being captured or whatever. And so David, who was his son-in-law, took over. He was actually a general under Saul. He would become the next king. They actually had a king between Saul and David, which I don't think you have to know him, but his name was Ishbaal. He actually briefly reigned, maybe, they theorize, but they think he was assassinated or something like that. So David came in. He's, like I said, the second major king that we have, who they think reigned about the early 10th century BC, about they think when he maybe lived. It's kind of debate about when they lived, these kings. So-called House of Judah or tribe of Judah. And so that's why they descend Jesus back to, like Jesus, you know about that in the New Testament later. And David was known for his military exploits. That's really the big thing that he's famous for overall. You may have heard the story of Goliath, like when he was in his youth. You know, he fought this Philistine who was a giant, and he, of course, killed him with a slingshot when nobody else wanted to fight him because they were too scared or whatever. So this kid basically killed him. And of course, it's been made into a lot of different statues. The most famous, of course, done by Michelangelo during the Renaissance and all that. He was also known for his victories against the Philistines. So under him, the kingdom of the Israelite state began to expand into, like, I guess where the southern part of Israel is, and maybe part of Jordan at that time. And don't forget, he also founded the capital of Jerusalem. Jerusalem becomes the capital of the United Kingdom, and later it's the capital of also the kingdom of Judah, also as well. It's not in the slides, but if you know the story about this, David had a famous wife named Queen Bathsheba, who was very beautiful. And actually, she was married to another man. I think his name was Uriah the Hittite, who was like a soldier that was in his army. And I think one time he was looking down upon the city and he saw her, how beautiful she was. I think she was taking a bath. And basically, she basically had her brought to him before he seduced her. And problem was, I think he impregnated her or something like that. And so he had to basically make it look like the other guy had impregnated her. And so when he wouldn't sleep with her, he had him killed. So that kind of deal. But Bathsheba, of course, was the mother of King Solomon, of course, later. So that's who he also, of course, had. The third king, of course, that's a very famous King Solomon. And he comes in. He's really the last, like I said, major king of the United Kingdom, although he had a son that also ruled afterwards as well overall. Of course, from the same tribe of Judah and all that. He's the peak ruler. Yeah, he lived about mid-10th century BC. Kind of debate about when it was, about when he lived. Solomon's famous for a lot of things. I think everybody's heard about the fact that Solomon was very wise, like full of wisdom. He read a lot of the different, some of the books of the Bible, like the Song of Songs or Song of Solomon, they think was written. Some of the Proverbs was written by him. So he's very wise, very wealthy. They always talk about King Solomon's mines and all that. But he had a kind of a soft spot for women, you know about it. And he had something like 1,000 women, maybe more, probably more than that. I think maybe more. It's more than Ramses, I guess, Ramses the Great. And I think it was like 700 wives and 300 concubines, I think is about what the Bible said, which is ridiculous. And so that's actually kind of a problem for him later, because I think it creates confusion on who should probably rule overall. But Solomon's more known for constructing the Temple of Solomon, the first of two temples of Jerusalem that would be built in Israel, which is now located where the Temple Mount is, which if you see that behind me, that's the Temple Mount back there in my picture. Yeah, the Temple Mount's back there behind me where the Wailing Wall is. And they think it was built about the 10th century BC overall. And they think they used artisans probably from Phoenicia. I think some of the Phoenicians may have helped build it, because the Phoenicians were great artisans with building buildings and ships and things like that. And they even built like a tabernacle inside of it, which housed the Ark of the Covenant, they believe. Although it's debated about what happened to the Ark. Some people think it was stolen by different civilizations. So it's kind of a debate about what happened to it. That's kind of a mystery. I don't know if anybody knows. I don't think it's in Ethiopia, like a church claims. But now what happened, though, Solomon would eventually die, and that's when all the problems started. After he died, the states split into two different states. You have eventually these two, which I told you were the kingdom of Israel, which is in the north, and then the kingdom of Judah, which was in the south. Samaria is sometimes a name they call, by the way, the one in the north. Kingdom of Samaria or kingdom of Israel. And then the kingdom of Judah was based at Jerusalem still before. Why did they split? Well, the king that came in after Solomon died was Rehoboam, one of his sons. Like I said, he became its first ruler of a dynasty of kings related back to the tribe of Judah. Benjamin was also part of it too. They kind of joined it, because Benjamin was the other one that was related back to like Saul and all that. They say the reason why they split was over taxes. The fact that Solomon had raised heavy taxes, like to build a lot of these buildings, like the Temple of Solomon, and apparently Rehoboam didn't want to lower the taxes. And so what happened was there was a minister that was under Solomon named Jeroboam. He broke away with the other tribes, like 10 other tribes. They formed their own state, which became known as the Kingdom of Israel. They kind of kept the name, I guess, which was based at Samaria. And so they were kind of north of south of each other. Samaria is kind of like in the West Bank, in the northern part of it, Palestine. And in Jerusalem, is to the south of it, basically. So two states basically broke up. They never got back together. That's something that's true, about the situation with that. They never got, they probably may have traded with each other, and all that. But the two never got back together. And it probably is part of why they declined, like the Israelites as states, at that point. Because eventually what happens to them over time, they eventually get conquered by other people. Other people come in and start conquering them. And it's mostly because you got these more powerful states that are everywhere. The two main groups, I guess states that were empires that were real powerful were, of course, you have the Babylonians and the Assyrians. Those two groups eventually conquer what's left of those two states. And the first state I'll mention first, which was based, I told you, at Samaria, it was believed to have been conquered by different kings. That's a typo there. That should be Sargon II, looks like it. But actually, it's actually three kings were the ones. Sure, I guess I won't put the other one in there. But the Assyrian kings of Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and there's also another one you may have heard in the Bible named King Sennacherib. He was another king that also fought them as well. And over time, the Israelites were eventually deported, like I talked about before, back to like Assyria. Some of them, I think, ended up in Iran for some reason, where they were used as slaves or put in their armies. And so most of them didn't come back. If they did come back, they joined the kingdom of Judah. They think some like I think there was one called the Samaritans, I think was one that survived or something that was part of them. They were kind of joined with the kingdom of Judah. Then the other state, now Judah survived. It was like a vassal state or a client state to the Assyrians, because Judah had like a lot of olive oil that they had. And so it was kind of important. And so they kind of stayed around, but they were kind of like a puppet state to the Assyrians and were kind of weaker and all that. But after the Assyrians collapsed as an empire because of the Chaldeans conquered them, you had Nebuchadnezzar came in, and Nebuchadnezzar eventually would attack the kingdom of Judah. Why did this happen? Well, after Assyria declined, the Chaldeans came about as an empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Judah allied with the Egyptians, with that state. And so this angered Nebuchadnezzar. And so over a period of I think a decade or two, it took him a while, he eventually sacked and conquered it, basically. And so 586, they think maybe it's about when they think Jerusalem fell to Nebuchadnezzar's forces. And of course, the Temple of Solomon was eventually destroyed. They think that's maybe when the ark disappeared. There's kind of a debate about it, although some people think the ark was hidden somewhere, so they couldn't find it. It's kind of a debate about that. They don't know what happened to the ark. But what they do know happened was that about 10,000 or more of their people were deported back to Babylonia. And so that led to the so-called Babylonian captivity, as they called it, where the Jewish people, as they're called later, of course, remained under Babylonian rule for something like 40, 50 years overall. Now, they do go back. That's true about that. They later, the Persian Empire comes in, which I'll talk about later, probably next week. But Cyrus the Great, who was the founder of the Persian Empire, he came in and conquered Iraq, and he freed the Jewish people. And so they all went back a lot of them went back to Israel. Some of them did stay in Babylon, by the way, Babylonia. But a lot of them went back to Israel, and they formed another temple, which is the Second Temple of Jerusalem, which they think was found sometime in the 510s BC into the 6th century BC, maybe 516. They're not sure that exact date either about. But the Second Temple will be around a long time. It'll be around for almost not quite 600 years. I think it's 580-something years is how long it's around until the Romans destroy it. In 70 CE. And that's when you get that Jewish diaspora, where all the Jews are kind of spread throughout, the ancient world. And that's why a lot of Jews, end up in Europe later, a lot of different countries, more or less. So that's kind of the history of, what happens, like the early Jewish people, Israelites, how their culture evolved over time. Later, you'll have what they call modern Judaism that'll come about. Of course, they'll kind of go away from the temple. After the temple was destroyed, they'll develop like rabbis, as you know, which are like teachers and the religious leaders of the Jewish faith. And of course, they have the synagogue, which becomes like kind of like a church to the Jews, to what we would call a church, I guess, for us. Synagogue really means house of prayer, usually. Hebrew. But over time, Judaism evolves, especially during like medieval, up through like the Age of Enlightenment. It evolves into what we call modern Judaism that we have today. So anyway, so that's kind of the history of the Phoenicians and of course the Israelites overall. I guess I don't have any questions today. Overall, looks like nobody posted anything important. But I want to remind you, don't forget, I've got a bunch of assignments, that you need to work on, of course. Now we got Mardi Gras coming up Monday, Tuesday, but don't forget, the Egypt video quiz. I did push it back till Friday. I think the stream went down on it, but I put it back up. If you haven't done it yet for that video, watch and do the quiz on. And then don't forget the first exam is due next week. Not till next week. I'll probably give you extra time on that because of Mardi Gras. But importantly, the vocab, that first vocab, of course, first key terms assignment, that's due this Friday. So go ahead and start uploading that to the speed grader and all that for me to get that done. If you don't know what the speed grader is, it's like if you go to the assignment in Canvas, it should be like a submit button at the top, and if you click it, it goes to the bottom of the page where you input data or comments, etc. So that's it for today. If you have any questions about this lecture, just send me a message, comment, question or whatever through my channel. And that's it. So I hope y'all have a great Mardi Gras coming up Monday and Tuesday next week. Remember, we don't have classes those days. So next week on, I think it should be Wednesday, looks like February 17th, I'm going to be lecturing about the Persian Empire. So that's my next thing I'm going to be doing. Later, we'll have a quiz, by the way, on all this. Phoenicians, Israelites, Persians. That'll be coming up, but it won't be till probably late next week. So y'all take care. Y'all have a great Mardi Gras again and weekend coming up, and I'll see you later. So take care.